Chapter 1: The Spark of War. In the sweeping silence of the Mongolian steppe, under skies that seemed to stretch into forever, a single figure stood atop a ridge, motionless atop his dark stallion. The man's thick cloak fluttered in the dry wind, and his eyes were set on the distant horizon. This was Temujin, a name already known in whispered or across the lands, though the world would remember him as Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. In the spring of 1218, he ruled a united Mongolia and commanded one of the most formidable fighting forces the world had ever seen. The journey to this moment had not been simple. For decades, Temujin fought not only external enemies, but betrayal from within his closest circles. He had been hunted, exiled, starved, and nearly killed, yet he endured. Through sheer resolve, brilliance, and a reputation for both fairness and fury, he brought together the Mongol tribes under one banner. This unity gave birth to something the world had never faced before: a mobile, disciplined, and utterly relentless war machine. But in that moment, as the wind combed through the endless fields of grass and clouds drifted slowly above, Genghis Khan was not thinking of conquest. He was thinking of peace. The empire he had built needed trade more than bloodshed. His people thrived not only on the spoils of battle, but also on commerce. The Silk Road, winding through Central Asia, was the artery of wealth and information. On its other end lay the Khwarazmian Empire, vast, rich, and strategically placed in the lands that today form parts of Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and beyond. The Khwarazmians controlled Bukhara, Samarkand, Nishapur, cities famed for their markets, scholars, and towering minarets. In the spirit of diplomacy, Genghis Khan reached out to Shah Alar ad-Din Muhammad II of Khwarazm. He proposed peace and trade. He sent word of friendship, mutual prosperity, and the potential for a future where caravans, not armies, crossed the deserts. This was no hollow offer. Genghis Khan was sincere in his intentions. War, to him, was a tool, not a craving. To show good faith, he dispatched a trading caravan of nearly 500 men to the city of Otrar, a prosperous frontier outpost of the Khwarazmian Empire. These men were merchants, translators, guards, and officials. They bore no weapons of war, only goods and scrolls bearing the seal of the Khan. But trust, once offered, can be shattered with a single act. In Otrar, the governor, Inalchik, an uncle of the Shah, looked upon the caravan with suspicion. Perhaps he believed the Mongols were spies. Perhaps he coveted the wealth they carried. Either way, he ordered the entire caravan arrested. Their goods were confiscated. Their lives were ended. When word of this betrayal reached Genghis Khan, it did not spark immediate fury. It sparked restraint. He believed the act must have been a mistake, perhaps committed without the Shah's approval. Hoping for a peaceful resolution, he sent a second delegation of 3 ambassadors to the Shah himself, demanding justice and the punishment of Inalchik. This was a critical moment. The fate of the Khwarazmian Empire, and perhaps of Central Asia itself, balanced on the Shah's response. But Alar ad-Din made a fateful choice. Whether blinded by arrogance or ignorance, he not only refused Genghis Khan's request, he killed the lead ambassador and humiliated the others, shaving their beards and sending them back in disgrace. This was more than a breach of etiquette. In the Mongol worldview, ambassadors were sacred. To kill one was to insult the gods themselves. To defile their honor was to spit upon the principles of peace. The message had been made clear: the Shah did not fear the Mongols. But he should have. Genghis Khan gathered his closest generals in a war council. They sat in silence inside a large GR, the felt walls dimly lit by flickering oil lamps. Maps, handmade and incomplete, were spread across the ground. Each general listened as their Khan spoke, not with shouting, but with calm purpose. They have taken what was given in peace. They have dishonored our word. They have spilled the blood of those who came unarmed. Now, they will learn what comes of such arrogance. There was no celebration, no cheering, only nods of understanding. War was not a sport to the Mongols. It was a storm, unleashed only when necessity demanded it. The preparations took time. Genghis Khan did not rush to war. He studied the region. He learned about the Khwarazmian army, their numbers, their weapons, their weaknesses. He coordinated with scouts, merchants, and spies. He ensured supply lines would be ready. And when he moved, it was like thunder rolling over the horizon. In the spring of 1219, the Mongol horde began its march west. Estimates suggest 100,000 to 150,000 men rode with him, horse archers, siege engineers, and support crews. They did not travel as a single mass. They split into columns, approaching from multiple directions. Some would feint toward the north. Others would swing from the south. Confusion would be their ally. Their first target, Otrar. The city that had sparked the war was now to become its first lesson. Inalchik had fortified Otrar's defenses. He believed the city could withstand a siege. And, for a time, it did. The Mongols laid siege for 5 months. It was grueling. But the Mongols had learned from their Chinese campaigns. They brought siege engines, catapults, and tactics that went beyond the cavalry charge. Eventually, a portion of the wall collapsed. The Mongols poured in. Street by street, the city was taken. Inalchik barricaded himself in the citadel, but his resistance was futile. Captured, he was brought before Genghis Khan. And there, a punishment was carried out so severe it would pass into legend. Some say molten silver was poured into his eyes and ears. Others say he was trampled under horses. The truth may never be known, but the message was unmistakable. The blood price had been paid. Otrar fell. Its people were scattered. But Genghis Khan was not yet done. The Khwarazmian Empire still stood, and the Shah had fled. And so, as night fell and the fires of the Mongol camp flickered in the wind, the Khan looked again to the west. The storm had only just begun. Chapter 2: Desert March. The fires of Otrar had barely cooled when Genghis Khan turned his gaze further west. The betrayal was not forgotten. It was simply no longer the immediate concern. The Khwarazmian Empire was vast, its cities spread across deserts, oases, and mountain valleys. The Shah, Alor ad-Din Muhammad II, had not stood to face the Mongols at Otrar. He had fled, retreating deeper into his lands, leaving his governors to fight and die in his place. But Genghis Khan was not chasing one man. He was unraveling an empire. To do so, he would need to move fast, strike hard, and carry his army through some of the harshest terrain on earth. The Mongols were used to hardship. Their homeland was a land of extremes, brutal winters, scorching summers, and wide stretches of open land where survival depended on movement and adaptability. Still, the deserts of Central Asia were another matter entirely. Between Otrar and the next major target, the grand city of Bukhara, lay hundreds of miles of barren land. Little water. Scattered oases. Blistering heat by day, freezing cold by night. No roads. No shelter. But Genghis Khan had no intention of taking the obvious path. The Khwarazmian generals expected the Mongols to march southwest from Otrar to Bukhara. They assumed Genghis would follow the caravan routes, where horses could be watered and armies could rest. But that was not how the Khan waged war. Instead, he sent out scouts and surveyors to find a way through the Kyzylkum Desert, a vast sea of red sand and stone. a place so dry and hot that no army in memory had ever tried to cross it. The decision was as bold as it was dangerous. The Mongol army carried supplies on carts pulled by oxen. They brought extra horses for every man. Water skins were filled and tightly sealed. Herds of livestock followed the columns, serving as food on the move. The army broke into several divisions. One, led by Genghis himself, would attempt the desert crossing directly to Bukhara. Others would take surrounding routes, sowing confusion and drawing Khwarazmian forces away. Each night, as the stars wheeled overhead and the air grew cold, the Mongol soldiers would lie down in silence, wrapped in heavy cloaks. They traveled mostly at dawn and dusk to avoid the worst of the sun. When water ran low, they dug for it near routes or pressed on to the next oasis. They rationed grain, cooked with dry dung, and slept with one ear open. Discipline was absolute. Any man who stole water or abandoned his post was executed. Despite the harshness, the Mongols endured. Weeks passed. The wind swept over the dunes. The hooves of horses churned the sand. And then, one morning, the desert broke open to reveal a distant skyline, minarets, domes, and towers rising above the flat horizon. Bukhara, a city of ancient wealth and knowledge. It had been a center of learning for centuries, home to scholars, poets, and traders. Its markets bustled with silk, spices, ceramics, and gold. Its walls were high and thick, guarded by archers and soldiers. The people of Bukhara were confident. After all, who could possibly attack from the east, through the wastelands? And yet, here they were. The Mongols had arrived where no army should have. They had crossed the desert like ghosts. Panic rippled through the city. The garrison rushed to man the walls. Messengers were sent to the Shah. Civilians packed their belongings. Some tried to flee, but it was too late. Genghis Khan did not attack immediately. He camped outside the city, just out of bowshot, and waited. He sent envoys to the gates. Surrender, and you shall be spared. Resist, and you shall see ruin. The offer was standard. Some cities in the past had taken it and survived. Others had refused, and their names were now smoke on the wind. Bukhara hesitated. Inside the city, debates raged. Some believed the Mongols were bluffing. Others urged surrender. In the end, the decision was made to resist. The defenders believed their walls would protect them. So the siege began. Mongol engineers set up siege towers, catapults, and ladders. They brought Chinese engineers to help construct machines capable of battering the walls. Archers rode close to the walls during the day, loosing arrows to pin down defenders. By night, the pounding of wooden beams echoed across the fields. The Mongols also made use of a devastating tactic: fear. They captured nearby villages and forced the people to carry supplies, dig trenches, and build siege works under threat of death. These human shields often walked in front of the Mongol lines, making it harder for defenders to shoot. Within days, a breach was made. The Mongols surged into the city. Street fighting broke out. The defenders fought bravely, but the surprise and the psychological pressure were too great. Slowly, inevitably, the city fell. Genghis Khan entered Bukhara not as a conqueror drunk with power, but as a ruler delivering justice. He rode into the mosque and addressed the assembled leaders. "I am the punishment of God," he said. "If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." His words, recorded in multiple sources, were not boasts. They were truths. To the Mongols, this was divine justice, not random violence. The elite were executed. The soldiers disarmed. The remaining population was spared, but the city was plundered. Treasures were seized. Armories emptied. The libraries, surprisingly, were mostly left untouched. Genghis had a respect for knowledge, even in conquest. Bukhara was not destroyed. It remained standing. But it would never again be the same. The fall of Bukhara was a signal to the rest of the empire. The Mongols were not to be underestimated. They could go where no army dared. They could strike with precision and vanish like a storm. But Genghis Khan was not finished. Just days later, he turned his gaze southward, toward Samarkand, the jewel of the Khwarazmian Empire. The march would continue, and the empire would tremble. Chapter 3: The Siege of Samarkand. The fall of Bukhara sent shockwaves through the Khwarazmian Empire. News traveled slowly through the desert, carried on the hooves of fleeing messengers and whispered by terrified traders. Cities that had once believed themselves too grand, too fortified, or too far away to be threatened were now uncertain. The Mongols had not only crossed the impassable desert, they had taken one of the most glorious cities in the empire with terrifying ease. Yet the Shah, Alauddin ad-Din Muhammad II, did not return to face them. He continued to retreat deeper into his territory, hoping to gather strength, to regroup, to wait out what he hoped would be a temporary incursion. He still had Samarkand, larger, richer, and even more heavily defended than Bukhara. With its garrison of over 100,000 troops, including elite guards and foreign mercenaries, Samarkand was the pride of the empire. If Bukhara was a jewel, Samarkand was the crown. Genghis Khan did not hesitate. He knew momentum was a weapon, and he had no intention of letting fear slip away from the minds of his enemies. After only a few days of rest in Bukhara, the Mongol forces gathered once more and began the short march southeast to Samarkand. This time, they moved faster. The roads were more passable, the terrain less harsh, and the scouts had already prepared the route. As the sun rose one morning, the towers and blue domes of Samarkand came into view. Genghis Khan halted his horse on a low ridge to observe the city from afar. There it lay, elegant, bustling, defended. It had thick walls, iron gates, and thousands of soldiers lining the parapets. Behind those walls lived not just warriors, but scholars, artisans, and families. The defenders believed they could withstand any siege. But Genghis Khan did not simply besiege cities. He dismantled them, inside and out. Before the first arrow was loosed, he sent another message. Surrender, and your people shall live. Resist, and the city shall fall with you. No response came. The defenders braced for war. So the siege began. The Mongols surrounded the city on all sides. Genghis divided his forces into units, each assigned a section of the wall. Engineers began building siege engines, battering rams, catapults, and siege towers. Some of these were left behind by fleeing Khwarazmian forces. Others were constructed from scratch using wood from nearby groves and supplies carried across the steppes. Day and night, the Mongols worked. Drums echoed across the plains. Fires burned. Horses were kept in rotating shifts to graze and rest. Arrows were crafted, boiling oil prepared, and pits dug to trap cavalry. The defenders of Samarkand were no cowards. They fought back fiercely. Archers rained volleys down upon the besiegers. Counter-siege machines hurled stones. Raids were launched to disrupt Mongol preparations. But the Mongols were patient and precise. Genghis Khan employed a new tactic: deception. He had some of his soldiers pretend to flee. They abandoned weapons, wagons, and horses, feigning panic. When the defenders came out to claim the spoils, Mongol cavalry hidden in the tall grass ambushed them. Dozens were killed. Others captured. The psychological pressure began to build. Inside the city, food stores dwindled. The population, already swelling from refugees, grew restless. Whispers of Bukhara's fate spread. Morale began to crack. And then came betrayal. A contingent of Turkish mercenaries, paid by the Shah to defend the city, saw the writing on the wall. They opened one of the gates in the dead of night, letting a Mongol unit rush in. Chaos followed. With the outer gate breached, the defenders scrambled. The Mongols poured into the city, not in a single wave, but in small, coordinated units. Each group had clear orders: secure key intersections, take towers, avoid unnecessary destruction. Still, the fighting was brutal. Blood flowed in the streets. Defenders fought from rooftops. Fires broke out in the market. Horses trampled stone and bone alike. By morning, it was over. Samarkand, the crown of the Khwarazmian Empire, had fallen. Genghis Khan did not enter in a fit of rage. He rode through the city with cold purpose. He had defeated a major center of resistance. But he knew this was not the end. The Shah still lived. Tens of thousands were executed. Others were spared and deported, sent east as laborers, artisans, or engineers. Skilled workers were often relocated to Mongolia or China, where their knowledge could serve the empire. Unskilled populations were sometimes absorbed into the army, forced to serve in future conquests. The city was not destroyed completely. Some buildings stood. Some homes remained intact. But the soul of Samarkand had changed forever. It would take generations to recover. Genghis Khan gathered his generals for a moment of quiet reflection outside the city walls. Maps were redrawn. Routes were reassessed. The army would split again, covering more ground, seeking the Shah who continued to flee. But one thing was clear: the heart of the Khwarazmian Empire had been pierced. And the pulse of resistance was growing weaker with every beat. Chapter 4: Divide and Devour. The walls of Samarkand had fallen. The smoke from its burned quarters still curled into the sky like the slow breath of a dying beast. And yet, Genghis Khan did not pause to admire his conquest. He stood with his generals outside the city walls, bent over maps drawn hastily on parchment, his mind already turning to the next phase of war. The Shah, Alauddin ad-Din Muhammad II, was still alive. He had not defended Otrar. He had not ridden to protect Bukhara. And now, with Samarkand lost, he had fled again, this time southward, toward the rugged terrain of Khwarazm and the distant shores of the Caspian Sea. Genghis Khan understood the power of symbols. Taking a city was one thing. Killing a ruler was another. As long as the Shah breathed, resistance could gather around him like dry brush near fire. But chasing one man across thousands of kilometers of wild terrain was a daunting task. He could not drag the entire Mongol army on such a pursuit. Instead, he would use the strategy that had brought him victory time and again: divide and devour. He called his sons and his most trusted generals, Jochi, Chagatai, Ojade, and the legendary Subutai. Each had already proven themselves in battle. Each was now given an assignment that would decide the future of an empire. The army would split into 4 main divisions. One would chase the Shah directly, moving swiftly toward Nishapur and Herat, hoping to catch him before he could cross into unfamiliar territory. Another would march west, through the northern trade routes, subduing the oasis cities and cutting off escape paths. A third would sweep south, clearing pockets of resistance and seizing smaller cities. And Genghis himself, with the central division, would move through the heart of Khwarazm, ensuring that no rebel force could regroup behind his lines. This was not a retreat. This was not a scattered raid. It was an encirclement. Each army moved like a spearhead, cutting into the fabric of the empire. And with each strike, they left behind messages of warning: surrender and live, resist and be erased. The tactic worked. Cities fell in rapid succession. Merv, once called the mother of cities, surrendered with barely a fight. Yet when a local garrison rebelled days later, the punishment was swift and horrific. It is said that more than 700,000 people were killed, though exact numbers are lost to time. The destruction was total. Nishapur resisted, believing in the strength of its high walls and loyal soldiers. But the siege engines came. The tunnels were dug. The gates burned. When the Mongols entered the city, they unleashed not only swords, but grief. Genghis Khan's favorite grandson, a son of Tului, had been killed during the fighting. In response, the city was leveled. Every living soul was put to death. Even the dogs. This was not madness. It was method. The Mongols did not simply conquer with force. They conquered with fear. Each city that surrendered was spared. In many cases, its leaders were left in charge under Mongol supervision. Artisans were sent to the east. Farmers kept their lands. Trade resumed. But each city that resisted met the same end. Walls crumbled, streets ran red, and their names were wiped from maps. The Shah continued to flee. He changed disguises, abandoned his wealth, and moved with a dwindling band of loyalists. His empire, once vast and proud, was now a fractured mirror. Pieces remained, but none could see the whole. Meanwhile, the Mongol generals executed their orders with precision. Jochi's forces captured the cities along the Syr Darya. Chagatai and Ojibwe moved toward Bork and Bamiyan. Subutai, the ghost general, led deep strike cavalry into the western fringes of Persia, striking cities before their guards could even shut the gates. The empire was being devoured in all directions. And in each conquered region, the Mongols left behind a system, not chaos. Tax collectors, messengers, local governors swearing loyalty. It was not destruction for destruction's sake. It was replacement. As the winter of 1220 approached, Genghis Khan paused near the ruins of Merv. He looked out over the desert, where the bones of an empire lay buried beneath sand and ash. The Shah had not yet been found. But he could run no more. The net was closing. And the iron storm still raged. Chapter 5. The Ghost General Subutai. In every great conquest, there are names that fade into history and names that echo. Among the Mongols, few names echoed louder than that of Subutai. He was not born a noble, nor was he the son of a famous warrior. Subutai was the child of a humble blacksmith, born near the forested edges of the Mongolian steppe. Yet through brilliance, loyalty, and unmatched military skill, he rose to become one of Genghis Khan's most trusted and feared generals. Where others saw obstacles, Subutai saw opportunity. Where others hesitated, he struck. And now, in the heart of the Khwarazmian campaign, Genghis Khan had unleashed him like a shadow upon the land. While the main forces continued to sweep through the major cities, Subutai was given a different mission: to break the western edge of the empire, to pursue and eliminate resistance in the outer provinces, and to sow chaos deep behind enemy lines. His orders were simple: vanish, strike, vanish again. Subutai did not travel with a massive army. He took with him a swift force of elite cavalry, lightly armored, highly mobile, and utterly silent. They carried little more than their bows, sabers, dried meat, and the determination to rewrite history. They moved by night, often without campfires. Scouts fanned out miles ahead of the main column, blending with the terrain, watching for patrols, measuring the movement of towns and cities. When resistance was found, it was mapped, flanked, and then struck with such speed that messengers rarely survived to send warnings. In the winter of 1220, Subutai began his sweep through the western corridor of the Khwarazmian Empire, a region that today would span parts of northern Iran, Turkmenistan, and eastern Georgia. The cities here had not yet felt the full force of the Mongol invasion. Many believed the stories were exaggerations, tales born of fear and desert wind. They would soon learn. The first major city to fall to Subutai's ghost campaign was Ray, a city known for its scholars, libraries, and trade. It had a garrison but was unprepared for the speed of the attack. One morning, the city awoke to the thunder of hooves and the whistling of arrows. Subutai's riders swept in from 3 directions. Within hours, the defenders were overrun. But Subutai did not stay. He took what the army needed: supplies, maps, fresh horses, and then disappeared into the hills before news could spread. This became his pattern: appear suddenly, strike decisively, vanish completely. The people called him the Ghost General. In city after city, panic grew. The Shah's remaining governors tried to prepare, but their information was always outdated. By the time they received word of a Mongol attack, Subutai was already gone, striking somewhere else. And yet, Subutai was not simply raiding. He was mapping, measuring, learning. He gathered information about roads, rivers, food stores, and political rivalries. He recruited local guides, sometimes sparing cities that submitted immediately and extracting valuable intelligence. He sent these reports back east, using the Mongols' sophisticated courier system, a network of horse relays that could deliver messages across thousands of kilometers in a matter of days. Through these reports, Genghis Khan learned everything: the shape of the land, the mood of the people, the weaknesses of his enemies. It was Subutai who first confirmed that the Shah had fled toward the Caspian Sea. Determined to catch him, Subutai and fellow General Jeeb took a bold risk. Instead of returning east to regroup, they proposed a wide westward arc, a ride that would take them out of Persia entirely, over the Caucasus Mountains, and into unknown territory. Genghis Khan approved. This decision would mark the beginning of one of the most extraordinary military journeys in recorded history, a multi-year campaign of over 9,000 kilometers through dozens of kingdoms, culminating in the later Battle of the Khalkha River. But in this moment, late 1220, Subutai's mission remained focused: finish what had been started, and close the western flank of the collapsing empire. As they rode through the Zagros Mountains, Subutai's forces encountered snow, wind, and treacherous parts. But they pressed on. They reached the fortress city of Hamardan, which surrendered with little resistance. From there, they split into smaller columns, striking isolated garrisons, attacking supply depots, and capturing fleeing nobles loyal to the Shah. Subutai's name became a whisper of fear. One legend tells of a town that prepared for months, believing they would resist the Mongols. But when scouts spotted a few distant riders, the town gates were thrown open immediately. The people offered food, gifts, and horses, praying for mercy. The Mongols passed through without drawing a blade. They had no intention of conquering. They wanted the next city to hear what had happened, and fear it even more. This was the essence of Subutai's genius. He did not just fight battles. He fought minds. Meanwhile, the Shah had taken refuge on a small island in the Caspian Sea. Sick, exhausted, and betrayed by his own generals, he died in obscurity, his empire reduced to ashes, his name already fading. Subutai had done his part. By early 1221, he turned eastward again, preparing to rendezvous with the other divisions for one final pursuit of the Shah's son, Jalal ad-Din. But that was yet to come. For now, the Western campaign was complete. The ghost had passed through, and nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 6: The Wrath of Nishapur. The winter wind had begun to loosen its grip on the land when the Mongol banners returned to the plains east of the great city of Nishapur. Snow still dusted the distant peaks, but the valleys were waking from their sleep. Green shoots pressed through the thawing soil. Spring had arrived, and with it, the full fury of the Mongol Empire. Nishapur was no ordinary city. Located in the province of Khwarazm, it had been a center of art, poetry, scholarship, and wealth. Its libraries were vast, its markets lively, and its walls high and thick. The people of Nishapur prided themselves on culture and resilience. But they were also proud, and pride, in the wake of a Mongol storm, could be a dangerous thing. By the spring of 1221, the Khwarazmian Empire had been broken in half. The Shah was dead, his body buried on a lonely island in the Caspian Sea. Samarkand and Bukhara were in Mongol hands. The empire's sons were scattered. Yet in Nishapur, resistance still lingered. The city had already faced the Mongols once, and had submitted. Initially, it had avoided destruction by surrendering and paying tribute. A small garrison of Mongol troops had been stationed there to maintain peace. The local leaders pledged loyalty. The city remained intact. But submission is fragile when resentment simmers underneath. In a calculated act of defiance, a revolt broke out. Led by local nobles and bolstered by scattered Khwarazmian loyalists, the people of Nishapur rose up. They ambushed the Mongol garrison, slaughtered the soldiers, and desecrated their remains. Among the dead was Takar, a beloved grandson of Genghis Khan and the son-in-law of Tului, Genghis's fourth son. When word of this betrayal reached the Mongol High Command, it was met not with rage, but with silence. Genghis Khan said little, but he turned to Tului and gave the order. "You will go," he said, "and you will show them the price of blood." Tului, quiet and disciplined, was not known for loud speeches. But in this task, he would become the vessel of his father's wrath. He gathered an army of over 70,000 men, horse archers, siege engineers, and auxiliaries, and marched toward Nishapur. The part they took was scorched behind them. Any village found aiding the rebels was burned. Any spy was impaled. No message would go ahead to warn the city. This was to be swift and absolute. The siege began in late April. The city's walls were strong, but the Mongols were stronger. Within days, they had encircled the city entirely. Siege towers rose like dark trees. Battering rams pounded the gates. Fire arrows turned the night sky into a storm of sparks. The defenders fought desperately. Every gate was reinforced, every tower manned. Women and children carried stones to the ramparts. Arrows were dipped in oil and lit. But the Mongols advanced like a tide. Tunnels were dug beneath the walls. Sappers planted charges. A section of the outer wall collapsed. Then another. The city braced for the final assault. And then it came. The Mongols entered in a wave. Streets once filled with laughter were filled with screams. Buildings were set ablaze. Defenders were cut down in alleyways, surrounded in courtyards. Temples and markets turned into battlegrounds. In just 3 days, it was over. Tului ordered the city cleared of survivors and divided into groups. Men, women, children, sorted, counted. And then came the execution. Chronicles differ on the exact numbers. Some say 100,000 died. Others say 1.7 million. What is certain is that the city was emptied of life. The earth turned red. Bodies were piled into pyramids. Heads were stacked at the gates. Not even dogs or cats were spared. This was not a spontaneous act of revenge. It was methodical. A warning to all cities that still considered resistance. A declaration: no blood spilled by Mongols would go unanswered. After the killing, the city was burned. Ash drifted for days. The air itself seemed to carry the memory of violence. Nothing stirred. No markets reopened. No bells rang. Nishapur was gone. And then, like a tide receding, Tului and his army left. He did not boast. He did not stay. The message had been sent, loud and clear. The wrath of the Khan could not be resisted. And yet, even after all this, the campaign was not done. Far to the south, in the shadows of the Hindu Kush mountains, the Shah's son, Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu, was gathering forces. Unlike his father, he would not run. He would fight. But that story had not yet begun. First, the last embers of the Khwarazmian heartland had to be extinguished. And the Mongols were still marching. Chapter 7: Pursuit into Persia. By the summer of 1221, the heart of the Khwarazmian Empire lay in ruins. The Shah was dead, his cities razed, and his armies shattered. Yet from the ashes of his father's flight, a new figure rose: Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu, the last crown prince of a broken dynasty. Unlike his father, Jalal ad-Din did not flee in fear. He had the fire of a warrior. Young, proud, and determined, he refused to surrender the legacy of his family without a fight. In the chaos left behind by the Mongols' devastating conquest of Central Asia, he began to gather what remained of the Khwarazmian military. From the southern reaches of Persia, through the plains of Azerbaijan, to the mountain valleys near Ghazni, he rallied soldiers, tribal allies, and commanders still loyal to the empire. He forged new alliances. He called upon Turkic warriors, Afghan fighters, and Persian militias. In time, he had assembled an army said to be over 30,000 strong. Some sources say more. His goal: to halt the Mongol advance and reclaim his throne. Genghis Khan, however, had no intention of allowing the embers of rebellion to reignite. He had watched as cities fell, one by one, but he had not yet personally confronted this new challenger. Now, with most of the Khwarazmian realm under his control, he turned his attention fully to Jalal ad-Din. He would finish what he had started. The Mongols moved fast. Genghis led his elite forces south, through the mountain passes of Afghanistan, crossing high ridges and narrow canyons with terrifying speed. These were not open steppes, but jagged terrain that slowed most armies. But the Mongols were prepared. Their horses were small, strong, and sure-footed. They traveled light, lived off the land, and never lost momentum. In their path lay the city of Bamiyan, a fortress nestled high in the mountains. It had declared loyalty to Jalal ad-Din and was crucial to securing the eastern approaches. Genghis ordered the siege. The defenders fought fiercely. The mountainous terrain gave them confidence. But the Mongols adapted. Siege engines were dragged uphill. Trenches were dug into rocky soil. Arrows darkened the skies. In the fighting, another of Genghis Khan's grandsons, possibly a child of Tului, was killed. The death enraged the Mongols, and once the city was breached, it was utterly destroyed. The towering boulders of Bamiyan, carved into the cliffs centuries earlier, were said to have stood watch silently as the blood of an entire city soaked the earth. The road to Jalal ad-Din was now open. The prince had moved east, toward Ghazni, an ancient capital once revered for its art and learning. There, he made his stand. He fortified the city, strengthened his army, and prepared for the final confrontation. He knew the Mongols would come. He wanted them too. When Genghis Khan arrived, he offered terms. Surrender, and your men will live. Resist, and you will be crushed. Jalal ad-Din sent no reply. So the siege began. Unlike other cities, Ghazni did not fall easily. The prince's men were well-trained and disciplined. They used the walls wisely, fought with strategy, and held firm under pressure. But they could not match the Mongols' mobility. Genghis Khan, seeing that a frontal assault would cost too many lives, changed tactics. He withdrew some of his forces, allowing Jalal ad-Din to believe the siege was weakening. Then, at night, the Mongols circled the city and struck from an unexpected direction. The defences crumbled. The outer walls were breached. Jalal ad-Din escaped, barely, riding south with the core of his army, determined to regroup. But Genghis Khan followed. Personally. Thus began a chase through the hills and valleys of eastern Persia, across deserts and rivers, through mountain passes and ravines. Jalal ad-Din proved a cunning adversary. He used guerrilla tactics, striking supply lines, ambushing scouting parties, and vanishing into the wilderness. He moved swiftly, riding at night, sleeping little, relying on local support. For weeks, the two forces danced across the rugged landscape, neither willing to give in. At one point, Jalal ad-Din turned to face a smaller Mongol detachment in the open field, and won. It was a small victory, but it burned through the empire like fire. For the first time, someone had bested the Mongols in direct battle. Genghis Khan took notice. He called in reinforcements, tightened the pursuit, and vowed to destroy the prince before he could escape eastward. Eventually, Jalal ad-Din reached the banks of the Indus River. On the other side lay safety, India, with unfamiliar terrain and the chance to rebuild. But between him and the river stood the greatest battle of his life. Genghis Khan was coming. Chapter 8: Treachery and Turmoil. The sun rose red and slow over the eastern banks of the Indus River. The waters shimmered like molten glass, wide and restless, separating the known from the unknown. On one side stood Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu, prince of the fallen Khwarazmian Empire. On the other, the open land of Hindustan, a new beginning, perhaps, or a final escape. But he was not alone. Behind him, to the northwest, the dust of Genghis Khan's army thickened on the horizon. Jalal ad-Din had come far. From the broken cities of his father's empire, through the mountains of Afghanistan and the battlefields of Ghazni, he had held his army together through a storm of fire and steel. He had shown bravery, cunning, and tenacity in a war where nearly all others had fled or fallen. And now, with the Mongol storm at his back, he faced a decision: stand and fight, or flee across the river. The Indus was not merely a river. It was a threshold. To cross it meant to abandon Persia, to give up the dream of reclaiming his father's empire. It meant exile, uncertainty, and surrendering the land he had vowed to defend. But to stay was to risk everything. The night before, Jalal ad-Din had held council with his remaining commanders. They had perhaps 30,000 men left, many wounded and tired. Supplies were low. Morale flickered like a dying flame. Some urged him to flee across the river immediately. Others begged for one last battle, a show of resistance to prove that not all would bow before the Mongols. Jalal ad-Din listened in silence. Then, with calm conviction, he made his choice. "We will not run," he said. "Not today. Let the Mongols remember that the blood of kings still fights." His men prepared for war. But war, like fire, is rarely predictable. As the Mongol forces approached, word spread that some of Jalal ad-Din's allies, tribal leaders from nearby hill regions, had abandoned him. Others had sent messages of submission to Genghis Khan, offering their services in exchange for survival. Still others remained in the camp, undecided, their loyalty fraying under the weight of fear. One of Jalal ad-Din's most trusted commanders, a former general of his father, vanished in the night. His tent stood empty at dawn. Several hundred men had gone with him. Treachery. Genghis Khan had used more than arrows and sabers. He had used whispers, promises, and gold. His messengers had been busy in the weeks prior, reminding enemy commanders that survival was still possible if only they changed sides. Jalal ad-Din awoke to a smaller army than he had commanded the night before. Still, he stood firm. He arranged his forces in a defensive crescent near the riverbank. The high bluffs behind him protected the crossing, while the open plain before him gave room to maneuver. Cavalry on the flanks. Archers to the rear. Infantry at the center. He donned armor blackened by fire and rode a tall warhorse, his family's standard flying above his head. And then the Mongols came. They appeared like smoke, spreading wide across the plain, wave after wave, formation after formation. Genghis Khan himself was there, observing from a distant ridge. His generals, Jeeb, Subutai, and the sons of the Khan, moved like clockwork, coordinating the attack. The battle began at midday. Mongol horse archers surged forward, releasing volleys with deadly precision. Jalal ad-Din's archers responded in kind. Spears clashed, hooves thundered, and cries of war echoed across the plain. At first, the Khwarazmian line held. The prince fought like a man possessed, riding across the front lines, encouraging his soldiers, cutting down attackers with blade and bow. For a brief moment, it looked as though they might hold. Then, the Mongol trap was sprung. Genghis Khan had held a portion of his forces in reserve. At a signal, these hidden cavalry units appeared from behind the nearby hills and struck the Khwarazmian left flank. Panic spread. The lines wavered. Jalal ad-Din rallied his men, repositioned his cavalry, and led a brutal countercharge. Steel clashed on steel. Dust blinded both sides. But numbers and momentum favored the Mongols. By late afternoon, the Khwarazmian army was breaking apart. Treachery returned again. Several local commanders, seeing defeat looming, abandoned the field. Some tried to cross the river early, leaving their men behind. Others surrendered outright to the Mongols, hoping for mercy. Jalal ad-Din, surrounded on three sides, had only a narrow path left, toward the steep cliffs above the Indus. His bodyguards begged him to flee. The prince, exhausted and bleeding, looked around at the ruin of his army. He saw men who had followed him across deserts and mountains, now dying by the hundreds. He saw his dreams burning away. But he refused to die that day. Spurring his horse, Jalal ad-Din rode hard for the cliff's edge. Behind him, a Mongol detachment followed, eager to claim the prince's head. And then, with a shout of defiance, Jalal ad-Din urged his horse forward and leapt from the cliff into the Indus River below. It was a sheer drop, steep and treacherous. But he survived. He emerged on the far bank, alone, soaked and wounded, but alive. Genghis Khan, watching from the high ground, did not order pursuit. Instead, he reportedly turned to his generals and said, "Such a son should be born to every father." A gesture of respect for a worthy adversary. Jalal ad-Din would live to fight again, deep in the lands of India. But his empire was gone. His people scattered. And Genghis Khan had won his hardest battle, not because it was the bloodiest, but because it had demanded everything: strategy, endurance, and the will to overcome. The prince was gone. The war was over. But the world had changed forever. Chapter 9. Crossing the Hindu Kush. The river had swallowed Jalal ad-Din, and with him, the last flicker of resistance in the shattered Khwarazmian Empire. The dust of battle still clung to the plains beside the Indus. Charred standards fluttered in the wind. Bodies lay twisted among broken spears, and blood dried in the furrows carved by horses' hooves. The war was over. But for Genghis Khan, conquest was never the end. It was only the gateway to what came next. The Mongol army stood victorious, but far from home. They had marched thousands of kilometers through harsh deserts, dense cities, and treacherous mountain passes. They had endured heat, cold, starvation, and war. Now, the campaign that had begun 3 years earlier in vengeance for a slain trade caravan had expanded into a full-blown rewriting of geography. The Khwarazmian Empire no longer existed. In its place, the banner of the Great Khan flew over scorched earth and stunned survivors. Yet returning to Mongolia would not be simple. To get home, Genghis Khan had a choice of paths. The shortest and most direct route lay through the highest mountains in the world, the Hindu Kush. The name itself meant a killer of Hindus, a grim nod to the countless lives lost in its deadly terrain. Towering peaks, narrow passes, blinding snow, and thin air awaited those who dared to cross. The trails were barely passable in summer. Now it was late spring, and the snows were only just beginning to melt. Landslides, avalanches, and sheer cliffs were constant threats. But Genghis Khan did not fear mountains. He ordered the army to prepare. Supplies were gathered, pack animals readied. Spare horses were loaded with furs, grain, salted meat, and dried curds. Blacksmiths reinforced hooves with iron shoes. Scouts were sent ahead to chart a path and watch for dangers. And then, like a great wave turning back toward the ocean, the Mongol horde began to ascend. The lower valleys were quiet and green. Farmers peeked from their huts, stunned to see the Khan's banners passing. No resistance remained. No armies stood in their path. But as the roads narrowed and the elevation rose, the environment itself became the enemy. Rain fell, then sleet, then snow. The air grew thin. Horses stumbled. Men coughed and bled from their noses. Fires were harder to light. Ice gathered on saddle straps. Riders wrapped themselves in layers of felt and fur, pressing on through blizzards that blinded even the most seasoned warriors. One day, a caravan of supply animals slipped from a cliffside trail, plummeting into the gorge below. Several soldiers tried to rescue them. None returned. Another group, caught in a narrow pass during a snowstorm, was buried under an avalanche. Dozens died without a sound. But still, the army moved. Genghis Khan rode at the front, refusing special treatment. His presence gave strength. His silence gave resolve. When food ran low, he ate last. When men faltered, he helped them back onto their horses. His leadership was not a performance. It was lived, breath by breath, step by frozen step. There were no battles in the Hindu Kush, no cities to burn, no walls to breach. And yet, it was one of the most difficult campaigns the Mongols had ever faced. For weeks, they climbed. Through pine forests and icy ridges, across frozen rivers and jagged cliffs. Every step home was paid in exhaustion. But discipline held. The Mongols had been trained to endure, to adapt. And they had one another. Occasionally, they passed remnants of Jalal ad-Din's flight, burned camps, abandoned carts, shallow graves. The prince had crossed the mountains before them, fleeing into the Punjab, licking his wounds. But his path had been lighter. He had fewer men, fewer animals, and no burden of victory. Genghis Khan was bringing an empire with him. And yet, even amid the hardship, he continued to plan. At night, huddled beneath thick blankets, his generals gathered around fires. They discussed the future, new campaigns, new alliances. Genghis spoke of returning to China to settle unfinished business with the Western Shire. He discussed trade routes, potential enemies, and the need to reorganize the administration of the conquered territories. This was no ordinary retreat. It was a transition. Finally, after nearly 2 months in the mountains, the Mongols descended into the fertile valleys of northern Afghanistan. The snow receded. Rivers ran freely. Grass returned to the hooves of weary horses. Villages appeared again, and the first true signs of spring greeted the army like an old friend. They had made it. The army reassembled on the plains near Bork. Some units had taken parallel routes and now rejoined the main force. Tents were raised. Food was cooked. Songs, quiet at first, began to rise again. It was not celebration. Mongols did not rejoice after campaigns, but it was relief. In those camps, Genghis Khan held one of the most important war councils of his life. He reviewed reports from every general, discussed the condition of the troops, and restructured his plans for governance. He also sent letters eastward, to his family, his governors, and his allies. The message was clear. The campaign had succeeded. The Shah was dead. The empire had been avenged. And the Mongols had returned, stronger than ever. News of the Khan's survival and triumph spread ahead of him, like wind across the steppe. By the time he reached Mongolian soil again, he was not just a conqueror. He was a legend. He had crossed the Hindu Kush, not once, but with an entire army. No emperor in history had done what he had done. And still, Genghis Khan was not done. He would rest, but only for a while. Because the world was wide, and the storm was still gathering. Chapter 10: The River of Fire. The Indus campaign begins. The Mongols had crossed deserts and rivers, laid waste to cities, and survived the death-choked peaks of the Hindu Kush. Yet as the dust settled and the armies reassembled on the open plains of the south, Genghis Khan was already thinking ahead, not of rest, not of home, but of the distant horizon, where new lands shimmered in the golden heat of the Indian frontier. The campaign that had begun as an act of vengeance had become a machine of expansion. And now, with the Khwarazmian Empire erased, Genghis turned his attention to a new theatre, the lands beyond the Indus. Though Jalal ad-Din had fled across the river, his flight had not gone unnoticed. Refugees, soldiers, and scattered nobles had followed him into the Punjab. Word spread quickly to the rulers of northern India. A foreign prince with a broken army had crossed their borders, hunted by an even more terrifying force. At the time, northern India was fractured. The once great Ghurid Empire had collapsed into competing sultanates and regional kingdoms. Cities like Lahore, Delhi, and Multan flourished, but their rulers were wary, their alliances brittle. Few had the strength to challenge the Mongols. Fewer still dared. But Genghis Khan had no intention, yet, of launching a full invasion of India. He did not know the terrain, the rulers, or the political webs that tied the subcontinent together. Instead, his focus remained fixed on a singular task, capturing or killing Jalal ad-Din. The Indus River now stood between them. Jalal ad-Din had escaped with barely his life, leaping from the cliffs and swimming to the far bank. Now he sought to regroup in the Punjab, finding refuge among local rulers who either feared the Mongols or saw an opportunity to use the young prince against them. But Genghis Khan was relentless. He sent scouts across the river to map the terrain. He interrogated prisoners for information. He dispatched envoys to local Indian chieftains, warning them not to shelter the fugitive prince. Some listened. Others did not. Soon, reports returned. Jalal ad-Din had established a temporary court near the city of Lahore, gathering remnants of his army and forging new alliances. He had begun to act like a ruler again, issuing orders, collecting taxes, and making promises of resistance. For Genghis Khan, this was unacceptable. A decision was made. The Mongols would cross the Indus. It would not be easy. The river was wide and fast-flowing, swollen from spring rains and melting snow from the Himalayas. There were few known crossings, and local guides could not be trusted. But Genghis Khan had not conquered the world by choosing the easy path. He ordered the construction of rafts made from inflated animal skins, light, buoyant, and strong. Wooden pontoons were fashioned from dismantled carts. Horses were trained to swim across in groups, tied to one another, with their riders gripping manes and harnesses. At dawn one morning, under the cover of mist, the first wave of Mongol troops entered the river. It was slow, dangerous work. Some rafts capsized. A few men drowned. But the crossing continued. 4 hours, wave after wave of riders and supplies were ferried across, until a solid foothold had been established on the southern bank. The Mongols had done what many believed impossible. They had crossed into India. Immediately, they began to move. Villages were bypassed or spared. The goal was not conquest but precision. Subutai, still fresh from his westward campaigns, led a scouting force south toward Jalal ad-Din's last known location. The prince, however, had moved again. He had expected the Mongols to wait, to regroup, to fear the unknown. Instead, they came like fire. Jalal ad-Din attempted to mount a defense near the Ravi River, drawing support from local warlords. A skirmish unfolded, small but sharp. Arrows flew. Dust churned. The prince held his ground briefly, then withdrew deeper into the countryside. The Mongols pursued. The terrain was unfamiliar. The humidity weighed down armor and horses. Diseases began to appear. Flies, heat, and foreign plants made every step more difficult. This was no longer the dry plateau of Central Asia. This was a land of rivers, jungles, and unseen dangers. Yet Genghis Khan pressed on. He rode at the front, as always, watching the land, studying the people. He noted the differences, language, clothing, customs, but also the similarities: fear, ambition, the desire for peace at the price of silence. Eventually, the pursuit slowed. Jalal ad-Din had vanished again. Into the hills, perhaps, or deeper into the chaotic folds of Indian politics. Rather than extend the risk, Genghis Khan halted the campaign. He ordered his forces to rest. The Indus crossing had shown his enemies that nowhere was safe. The prince had been chased across a continent, and the Mongols had followed every step. The world had learned a new lesson. Borders could no longer protect the weak. The Mongol army lingered in the region for several weeks. They gathered intelligence, secured their crossings, and left behind scouts. But they did not press further into India. Genghis Khan had made his point. And now, it was time to return. He had new goals to pursue. The Western Shire and Jin dynasties in China had defied him. Messages from the East spoke of rebellion, delay, and insult. The world still had corners untouched by his fire, and he intended to visit them all. But the river of fire had been crossed, and the storm had touched India's edge. Chapter 11: Blood on the Indus. The Indus River flowed silently beneath the stars. Its waters, dark and deep, held the memory of 1,000 years of kings, merchants, pilgrims, and warriors. And now, it bore the echoes of a storm unlike any it had ever witnessed. The banks were littered with broken weapons, crushed armor, and the wreckage of desperate flight. Somewhere downstream, fishermen would one day find steel helmets among their nets and wonder what great war had passed over their waters. It was here, at this river, that Jalal ad-Din had made his final stand. And it was here that the Mongol army, after years of marching, finally met resistance worthy of their full attention. Though Jalal ad-Din had survived, leaping into the river from the cliffs above and vanishing into the current, many of his men had not. The field had been painted in fire and fury. Horses, maddened by noise and blood, had trampled both friend and foe. Arrows had flown like rain. Swords had clashed until their edges dulled and shattered. The ground, once firm, had become a churned sea of mud and corpses. Now, in the days following the battle, the Mongol army camped quietly on the northern banks. Fires burned low. Tents rose in neat rows. Sentries paced in silence. And Genghis Khan sat beneath his standard, listening to the night. He did not rejoice. He did not celebrate. Victory had been won, but not without cost. The campaign against the Khwarazmian Empire had begun with a single insult, the murder of a caravan. It had become a war that reshaped the map of Central Asia. Cities had fallen, rivers had run red, and an empire had been reduced to ash. And now, the final chapter of that war had ended in a flash of steel on the banks of the Indus. But in that silence, there was something else, reflection. The Mongols had never chased an enemy so far. They had never faced an opponent like Jalal ad-Din, determined, skilled, and proud. Though his forces had been shattered, his spirit had not. And Genghis Khan, in his own way, respected that. He reportedly said to his sons, "He is a man of iron. Had he served me, he would have held the world in his hands." Such praise was rare, and it was not given lightly. But now, the war was over. The Indus had marked the edge, not just of territory, but of necessity. There was no point in pursuing Jalal ad-Din deeper into India. The Khan had made his statement. He had crossed mountains, burned capitals, and silenced the heirs of Khwarazm. The world had watched, and the world had trembled. Still, the blood of the Indus would not be washed away so easily. Genghis Khan ordered his scribes to record every detail of the campaign. He had maps updated. He held court with his generals, seeking every lesson from every battle. Logistics, scouting, diplomacy, betrayal, all were reviewed in painstaking detail. He met with surviving local rulers, some trembling, others defiant, and laid the foundation for Mongol authority across Persia. Taxation systems were discussed. Regional governors were installed. Tribute was agreed upon. Roads were marked and way stations planned. The storm did not vanish, it settled. But as always, even in his stillness, Genghis Khan was preparing for the next march. While his sons and generals oversaw the pacification of Western Khorasan and the construction of new administrative centers, the Khan's thoughts turned east. He remembered the insult of the Western Shire. He remembered the unfinished war with the Jin dynasty. There was work yet to do. The Mongol army packed up its camps. The tents came down. The horses were fed. The banners were tied. And then, in one long, sweeping motion, the army turned away from the Indus. But they left something behind. A silence. A silence so heavy, it hung over the land like fog. A silence that filled the mouths of rivers, the alleys of ruined cities, and the hearts of the survivors. The Indus had witnessed many things, but now it had seen the blood of empires, and it would never forget. Chapter 12: The Cliff of No Return. There are moments in history when everything narrows to a single breath. A heartbeat. A choice. For Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu, that moment came at the edge of a cliff, high above the roaring waters of the Indus River. Behind him, the last remnants of his army lay shattered. Around him, Mongol cavalry swarmed like hornets. Ahead, nothing but the abyss. The prince's horse poured the rocky edge. Wind tugged at his cloak. Arrows struck the stone near his feet. Blood soaked his tunic from wounds he no longer felt. His men screamed behind him, cut down one by one. The Mongols were closing in. And yet, he did not flinch. With a final cry, half fury, half defiance, Jalal ad-Din drove his heels into his horse's flanks. And leapt. The horse flew from the cliff like a ghost given wings. For a heartbeat, both man and beast hung in the air. Then they vanished into the river below. The Mongols reined in at the cliff's edge. Genghis Khan himself arrived moments later, dismounting to observe. He watched the churning water for signs, bubbles, movement, a body. Instead, he saw only the flow of the river, indifferent and endless. After a long silence, he spoke. "Such a son," he said, "it should be born to every father." Jalal ad-Din had escaped. He would survive. And Genghis Khan, though triumphant, recognized the rare courage of the man who had stood against him until the very end. That moment became legend. But the cliff, in time, gained another name. The Cliff of No Return. Not because it could not be climbed again, but because it marked the end of an age. The fall of the Khwarazmian Empire. The furthest reach of Genghis Khan's westward campaign. The point beyond which the old world had ceased to exist. In the days that followed, the Mongols did not pursue the prince further. Jalal ad-Din fled into India, wounded but alive, a ghost among rival sultans and uncertain allies. He would fight again in the coming years, but never with the strength or unity he had once commanded. His empire was gone. His people scattered. And though he survived, his legacy would remain only as a whisper beneath the roar of the Mongol tide. But for Genghis Khan, the work was not yet finished. He summoned his sons, Jochi, Chagatai, Ojade, and Tului, to a war council by the river. The campaign had reached its natural end. Yet every victory demanded reflection. Every conquest required order. In the shadow of the mountains, under a sky streaked with orange and ash, the generals gathered around their father. There were no triumphal songs. No drunken feasts. Just the crackle of fire, the snort of horses, and the weight of decisions. Genghis Khan spoke slowly, deliberately. "We came to avenge," he said. "But now we must build." He ordered a full review of the campaign, from the initial insult in Otrar to the final battle at the Indus. He wanted to know what had gone right, what had gone wrong, and how the empire could learn. He had conquered for purpose, not pride. Messengers were dispatched eastward with instructions to prepare for administrative reforms. In cities like Samarkand and Merv, tax systems were to be standardized. Trade routes would be patrolled by Mongol riders to ensure safety. Foreign artisans and scholars, captured during the campaign, would be resettled across the empire to spread knowledge. In this, the Khan was unique. He did not simply destroy. He reproposed. But even as he laid the foundation for rule, he looked eastward with growing concern. The Western Shire had betrayed his earlier terms. The Jin dynasty, still clinging to northern China, had refused diplomacy. And though the West was now pacified, the East smouldered with unfinished business. The Mongol army, hardened by years of battle and travel, was ready. But before turning east, Genghis Khan gave a final order: erect a monument, simple but clear, on the cliff above the Indus. A stone stele. No grand temple. No carved heroism. Just a few lines in the Mongolian script. Here ended the pursuit of the last Khwarazmian prince. The storm passed. The world changed. Then he mounted his horse. The Khan did not look back. The army moved north, crossing back over the mountains, over the passes where so many had died, toward the rising sun. The Khwarazmian campaign was complete. But Genghis Khan's war had only just begun. Chapter 13: The Aftermath. The thunder of hooves had faded. The banners were lowered. The swords were sheathed. For the first time in years, silence followed Genghis Khan. The Khwarazmian Empire was no more. Its cities lay in ruin, its armies destroyed, and its rulers scattered or slain. The prince who had dared to defy the Khan had leapt from a cliff and vanished into legend. The rivers ran clear again, but the memory of what had passed lingered like smoke in the air. And now, the Mongols faced a new kind of task, not conquest, but control. What Genghis Khan had broken, he now had to bind. The aftermath of the campaign was not merely logistical. It was spiritual, cultural, and deeply personal. The war had cost lives, Mongol lives. Beloved commanders had fallen. Grandsons had perished. Friends had been buried in distant soil. Genghis Khan, though triumphant, bore the quiet scars of these losses. He turned his attention to governance. He was not a warlord driven by impulse. He was a statesman with vision. With the empire now stretching from the borders of the Caspian Sea to the doorstep of China, he knew that chaos would follow if structure did not. In the newly conquered lands, he did not seek to impose Mongolian culture by force. Instead, he absorbed. He allowed local leaders who submitted to continue their rule, provided they paid tribute and kept the peace. He invited Islamic scholars to his court. He respected the engineers, mathematicians, and physicians captured during the campaign, often relocating them east to serve in Karakoram or other Mongol centers. Genghis Khan issued orders for a census to be conducted in the former Khwarazmian lands. Taxes were to be fair, collected efficiently, and monitored by Mongol-appointed overseers. Postal relay stations, the Yam, were established throughout Central Asia, ensuring that messages could be carried across the empire in record time. Roads were rebuilt. Marketplaces were reopened. Caravan routes, once vulnerable to brigands and warlords, were now protected by Mongol patrols. And trade returned. Merchants, once terrified of crossing the steppes, now found security under the Khan's shadow. Goods from the Middle East, Russia, China, and India flowed freely through the region. Cities like Bukhara and Samarkand, though scarred, began to breathe again. The people, weary of war, embraced the peace that followed. But it was not peace for all. Some pockets of resistance remained. Small bands of rebels in the hills, nobles in hiding, towns that refused to yield. These were dealt with swiftly. Genghis Khan was merciful to those who submitted. But to those who defied him after the storm had passed, there would be no second chance. Within his own camp, new tensions brewed. Jochi, Genghis Khan's eldest son, had played a key role in the campaign. But doubts lingered about his legitimacy, whispers that he was not the Khan's true son, but the child of Bort's captivity long ago. Though Genghis never publicly denounced him, the strain between Jochi and his brothers, particularly Chagatai, grew. At a council near the Amu Darya, Genghis Khan faced the question of succession. Would Jochi, the eldest, inherit the empire? Or would the burden fall to Ojide, the steady and diplomatic middle son? Genghis listened. He asked questions. He weighed their words. In the end, he made a quiet but momentous decision. Ojide would succeed him as Great Khan. It was a choice not of favoritism, but of foresight. Ojide had shown restraint, vision, and the ability to hold the empire together. Jochi, brilliant in war but distant from the center, would be granted vast lands in the west, but not the throne. It was a wound that would fester. The Mongol army remained stationed in the west for many months. Winter approached. Snow dusted the hills. Fires burned in the Jaz at night. Songs returned, soft, mournful, echoing the long years of war. Genghis Khan, now in his mid-60s, rode alone often. He looked west and east. He thought of the world not as a collection of borders, but as a vast body in motion. He had reshaped its flow. He had bent rivers, torn down walls, and made kings tremble. But what he wanted most now was stability. He met with Sufi mystics. He listened to scholars. He asked questions about justice, law, and leadership. He wanted his rule to outlast his sword. In the months that followed, the administration of the West became more structured. New governors were appointed. Roads were built from city to city. A formal taxation system, based on productivity rather than brutality, was introduced. The Mongol grip tightened, but it did not strangle. And in Karakoram, news arrived of the return of the armies. The campaign was over, but its shadow would stretch for generations. 14. Legacy of the Khan. The wind swept low across the steppe, carrying with it the scent of smoke, snow, and distant fires. By the time Genghis Khan turned his armies eastward from the Indus, the world had already changed. Cities that had stood for centuries were gone. Trade routes had shifted like the sands. Languages had mingled, cultures collided, and entire peoples had vanished or been absorbed. The iron storm had passed through the heart of Asia, and nothing would ever be the same. But long after the arrows stopped flying and the hooves stopped pounding, one question remained. What would endure? The return from the Western campaign marked a new chapter for Genghis Khan. No longer just a conqueror, he now had an empire to govern, an empire so vast it stretched from the Caspian Sea in the west to the shores of the Yellow River in the east. It was said that a man could ride for a year and never leave Mongol territory. But such vastness demanded more than strength. It required structure. In the years that followed the Khwarazmian conquest, Genghis Khan focused on legacy, not as a monument to his ego, but as a blueprint for a world reimagined. He began with lore. The Yasser, his unwritten code of conduct, was refined and expanded. It governed everything from military discipline to theft, marriage, hunting rights, and religious tolerance. It was a code rooted not in tribal tradition, but in pragmatic order. All were subject to it, Mongol or foreigner, noble or peasant. Justice, in the Khan's view, had to be swift, impartial, and public. A man who stole from a caravan would be punished as surely as a commander who disobeyed orders. This rule of law, enforced without exception, gave merchants confidence and subjects a sense of fairness, however brutal its application may have seemed. Next came communication. Genghis Khan formalized the yam, an imperial postal relay system unlike anything the world had seen. Mounted couriers could cross vast distances in record time, changing horses at way stations placed every 25 to 30 kilometers. A message could travel from Samarkand to Karakoram in a matter of days. With communication came control. And with control, prosperity. The Khan protected merchants. He issued passports, known as Paiser, granting safe travel and free supplies to authorized traders. He understood that wealth came not from hoarding gold, but from letting it flow. Markets thrived. The Silk Road reawakened. Goods from Venice reached Lebanon, and Chinese silks found their way to Baghdad. Ideas, too, traveled: mathematics, astronomy, engineering, art. The Mongol Empire became the first truly global network. But not all was peaceful. As Genghis aged, tensions among his sons threatened to fracture the unity he had forged. Jochi, once favored, now remained distant and ill. Chagatai, loyal but rigid, clashed with his brothers. Tului, the youngest, held the eastern provinces, while Ojide, named heir, was given increasing authority to manage the center of the empire. Genghis Khan, always aware of the dangers of division, sought to secure harmony. He held great councils, Kurultayus, inviting not just his sons, but generals, scholars, and loyal allies. Here, decisions were made not by decree, but by consensus. It was a way to balance power, and a model of leadership few empires had ever attempted. The spiritual legacy of Genghis Khan was just as complex. He did not impose a single religion upon his people. Instead, he allowed all faiths to flourish: Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, and native shamanic traditions. Temples, mosques, and monasteries coexisted. Religious leaders were exempt from taxes. Debates between scholars were encouraged. All people believe in one sky, he once said. Let them worship as they will beneath it. This tolerance was rare in a world often scarred by sectarian violence, and it left a deep imprint across the regions he ruled. As the years passed, Genghis Khan did not slow. Even in his 60s, he led military campaigns, most notably returning to punish the Western Shia in the east, who had betrayed their oaths during the Persian campaign. But time does not yield to kings. In 1227, Genghis Khan died during the final siege of the Western Shia, under circumstances still debated. Some say he fell from his horse. Others whisper darker rumors. His death was kept secret for months, hidden even from much of his army, to ensure the transition of power would be smooth. His body was carried back to Mongolia, buried in an unmarked grave somewhere near the sacred Burkhan Khaldan mountain. No stone was placed. No monument built. He had never needed one. His monument was the empire itself. Genghis Khan's legacy endured. Under his heirs, the Mongol Empire expanded even further. It would stretch from Hungary to Korea, from Siberia to southern China. It would become the largest contiguous land empire in history. But more than territory, it left behind a framework. A lore that crossed ethnic lines. A trade system that linked civilizations. A tolerance that fostered innovation. A meritocracy that rewarded skill, not bloodline. Genghis Khan was a man of paradoxes, fierce destroyer and patient builder, illiterate warrior and global visionary, feared conqueror and principled ruler. His storm had reshaped the world. And in its wake, something new began to grow. Chapter 15: The Eternal Blue Sky. The sky above the steppe stretched endlessly, as it always had, blue, boundless, untouched. It was under this sky that a boy named Temujin was born. And it was to this sky that the man called Genghis Khan would one day return. In the year 1227, as the Mongol banners rose once more against the defiant Western Shia, Genghis Khan rode at the head of his army, just as he always had. He was in his 60s now, his hair grey, his face carved by wind, war, and time. But his eyes had lost none of their clarity. He still rose early, still inspected camps, still listened before speaking. And yet, something had changed. He knew his time was short. Some say he had received omens, strange dreams, the cry of unseen animals at night, a hawk flying north instead of south. Others say he suffered a wound during battle or a fall from his horse. Still others whisper of poisoning, betrayal, or divine recall by the eternal blue sky itself. What we know is this: before the fall of the Western Shire capital, Genghis Khan gave his last orders. He summoned his sons, his generals, and his closest advisors. They gathered around him in the twilight of his final camp, beneath the canvas of his felt GER, the scent of firewood and horse sweat thick in the air. And there, he spoke. He did not speak of his victories. He spoke of unity. He urged them to protect the bonds of brotherhood, to honor their oaths, and to think beyond bloodshed. He reminded them that an empire was not measured by the cities it burned, but by the roads it paved, the peace it preserved, the justice it maintained. Then, he gave instructions for his burial. No tomb. No name carved in stone. No procession of mourners. Let the earth hide me, he said. Let the sky remember. And so it was. When he died, peacefully, by most accounts, his body was taken in secret, carried across the steppes of Mongolia. Those who bore him were sworn to silence. The horses were shoeless to leave no tracks. Some say a river was diverted to hide the grave. Others say the men who buried him were themselves buried, so that no soul would ever find the spot. To this day, Genghis Khan's final resting place remains unknown. But his spirit never left. The Mongols mourned, but they did not collapse. His son Ojide would take the mantle of Great Khan. The empire would continue to grow, into Russia, into China, into Europe. The storm would swell once more. But the heart of it, the thunder at its center, was gone. Still, across the empire, his name was spoken with reverence, not only in fear, but in awe. To the Mongols, he was the man who gave them the world. To others, he was a destroyer. To many, he was both. But all agreed on one thing. Genghis Khan had changed the course of history. He had taken scattered, warring tribes and forged them into the most efficient and disciplined fighting force the world had ever known. He had torn down walls, literal and figurative, between East and West. He had laid the foundations for global trade and multicultural exchange. And he had done so not as a crowned king, but as a man of the land, under the open sky. His laws endured. His system of rule endured. His descendants would shape history for generations, from the Yuan dynasty in China to the Golden Horde in the steppes. And yet, Genghis Khan never built a palace. He never wore a golden crown. He never claimed to be divine. All he ever claimed was a mission, to bring order from chaos, to avenge injustice, and to open the world, by force, if necessary. In the end, his true monument was not stone. It was the silence of a cliff above the Indus, the dust of Samarkand, the roads of Karakoram, the fear in the hearts of tyrants, the pride in the hearts of horsemen, and the wind over the steppe. That wind still carries his name. Temujin, the Khan of Khans, the storm that shaped the sky,